All right, so the book, The Affordable City, me, Shane Phillips. Um, I'm going to talk about the book briefly and then kind of focus on things I've been researching myself, things I've been learning the past 3 or 4 years since writing the book. And I also want to pitch, and I'll share a little bit more about it at the end, but we also have a podcast we've been doing for the past 3 years called UCLA Housing Voice, where every 2 weeks we bring a researcher on to talk about some work that they've published, usually in the last few years or months, on something in like a peer-reviewed journal, something usually in-depth, really kind of academic. But our whole purpose of that podcast is to talk about these things in non-academic terms and bring them to a wider audience, so that they're not just stuck behind these paywall journals, and really bringing the work that a lot of researchers around the country and around the world have been doing to a broader audience. So again, the book is really two things. One is an argument for a comprehensive, holistic approach to housing policy, and then it's a handbook of actual policies and different strategies to consider if you want to put together a comprehensive approach to housing policy and enact those reforms. So I'm going to open this the same way I open my book, which is with a quick case study on a development in Los Angeles, which goes by the name Yucca Argyle, named after its cross streets. This was actually, in some ways, the genesis of my book, reading about this back in 2015, 2016 or so. So this project is 200 units. It includes 40 reserved for low-income households, deed-restricted affordable housing, built with no private subsidies of any kind. It's in Los Angeles, a market rate one bedroom, at least at the time this was proposed, would probably go for around $2,500 a month. But those 40 income restricted units in this building would probably rent for closer to $800 or $1,000 a month. So very, very steep discount, again, with no subsidies whatsoever. Even compared to a 50 or a 75-year-old apartment building, which is common in Hollywood where this was proposed, this is a very, very good deal, $800 to $1,000 a month, probably a 30 to 50% discount, even over an older building. And that comparison is important because this project would be replacing one of those older apartment buildings. It'd be 200 units replacing 40. So if we were to look at this project from a high level, which is how I really came to this project looking at it, this is just objectively a good trade. Right, a little bit. You're taking 40 rent stabilized units, which, rent stabilization does keep rents a little lower. But these were probably renting on average in the $1,200 to $1,500 a month range, if not more. And we're replacing them one for one, really, plus all the market rate units, with 40 income restricted units at that much lower rent. And they would be deed restricted for 55 years. Whereas rent stabilized units, when they turn over, they go back to market rate. On top of that, we're getting these 160 market rate units. That's going to help absorb growing demand. It's going to help stabilize prices, densify the neighborhood, create new tax revenues. It's 2 blocks from a subway station. Just a good project overall. And yet there was a lot of opposition to it, and by the people who lived there at the time. They had a really large and effective protest. And as much as I understood and can see the big picture benefits of this project, I completely understand their opposition as well. And I just want to explain why here. So the problem arises when we shift our frame from big picture, this is good for the city, to asking what's happening to individual households when we have a project like this. So yes, you're going to replace rent stabilized units with these longer term deed restricted, lower rent, below market units. And that is a great thing. But the current tenants would not be the ones to benefit by and large. Some would earn too little to be eligible, others would earn too much. And even the ones who did fall within the correct income range, we're going to be competing with probably 1,000 or more people for a lottery for those 40 spaces. So most of them were just not going to really benefit. These tenants would get up to $20,000 as like a displacement mitigation fee. And that's a lot. Of course, it's much more than most cities would offer in this kind of situation. But if you live in your unit for 15 or 20 years, you're paying $800 a month in a market where a similar unit is $1,500 a month, you're living on a fixed income, perhaps, that $20,000 is not going to take you very long. It's going to be gone in less than 2 years, potentially. So in that case, $20,000 is just not an adequate compensation for that loss. So of course, the tenants who live here are going to oppose this project. And I don't think they're NIMBYs for doing so. I don't think this is like, unjustifiable or just purely selfish, or to the extent it's selfish, I think it's selfishness that is warranted. These are people who will be made like unquestionably, irrefutably worse by this project, despite its many benefits. The fact that the beneficiaries are not just developers, but also future residents of the new building is not going to convince any of these tenants that they should support this project and support their own displacement. So my main takeaway from this story is that, depending on your perspective, you can see this as purely bad or purely good. And within the confines of either perspective you want to take, you might be right about it. But we shouldn't, especially in a group like this, I think, confine ourselves to one perspective or another. We need to be able to see things from many different perspectives. The region-wide benefits absolutely matter. Cities all over the US absolutely need a lot more housing, and the regional benefits cannot be the only thing that we concern ourselves with. We also need to be concerned with how individual people and individual households are going to be affected. And for those who are focused on tenants, the reverse is also true. The regional benefits matter, and we have to recognize the status quo imposes its own costs that tend to fall on the most disadvantaged. I don't think anyone here will find it controversial when I say that housing folks often find themselves in factions, and we're often categorized either as pro-housing or as pro-tenant. And when you're identified as one, it's kind of automatically interpreted as being opposed to the other. If you're pro-tenant, you're anti-housing. If you're pro-housing, you're anti-tenant. And but I don't think these positions are actually contradictory, and I'm sure many people in the room agree. I think where this comes from, though, is the stereotypical pro-housing YIMBY person looks at a project like the Yucca Argyle, and they focus on this question of who is benefiting from this. What are we getting that is positive from this project? The stereotypical tenant advocate looks at something like this and asks who is harmed. And the message of my book, I think, and a through line of my research and advocacy is that we all need to start asking both of these questions, and that when we do that, we will actually just get better policy without even really trying. And we're going to get better partnerships to actually do the things we care about doing along the way. So this was sort of the realization that started this process for me. Something I didn't come to realize until well after writing the book is that I was doing something that President Eisenhower, maybe apocryphally, referred to as enlarging the problem. It's this idea that if you can't solve a problem, enlarge it. He wasn't talking about housing with this specific quote, but the basic idea here is that housing, like most things in the world, is complicated, and trying to solve one problem will always create some kind of problem elsewhere. It creates winners and losers. It's very hard to avoid that. People are more inclined to fear potential losses than they are to appreciate potential gains. So when we pursue a single issue, say upzoning a neighborhood, that can generate a lot of genuine, I think, good faith opposition from people who, in this example, might be concerned about displacement. I think we can and we should try to design our policies and programs to minimize those unintended consequences, but that's not always enough. It's usually, there's still something left over at the end of that usually. Sometimes you just have to tackle those unintended consequences with their own intervention. So it can't just be upzoning a neighborhood, it has to be something complementary to that as well. You have to enlarge the problem, working to solve not just that initial core issue that you were interested in, but also the other problems that might arise from the solution itself. So just for example, if you're permitting more housing and that raises concerns about gentrification and displacement, the solution clearly is not to permit less housing. We need housing. That is an unavoidable truth. It's to tackle those consequences head on. It's to actually acknowledge that they might be real, or identify the cases where they are real and do something about them. So if we're worried that upzoning will displace vulnerable renters, instead of opposing that upzoning, we could pair it with displacement protections and mitigations. We could upzone more broadly, not just a single neighborhood, to make sure that we're not concentrating a whole lot of development all at once in one place. And also, not concentrating development where multifamily housing already exists primarily, as we tend to do. And So that's sort of like one side of this. The other side of this is just, for example, if you're worried a policy like rent stabilization, I realize is not legal in the state because of state preemption, but just I think you're all familiar with what rent stabilization or rent control is. Instead of opposing this protection, we can do things that, because it can suppress supply if it's designed poorly, we can pair a policy like this with upzoning to create capacity elsewhere. We can increase the speed and certainty of housing approvals to sort of offset some of the potential cost of a policy like this. And we can do things like exempting units for their first 15 or 20 years of life, which is really the time when developers are most concerned about the impacts of rent stabilization. And there's other things like vacancy decontrol and a whole bunch of other policies that can really balance various concerns. Yes, that's actually, thank you for raising your hand, because I did want people to interrupt me. I'm going to get more into like current events a little bit, but yeah, throughout, please ask whatever you like.
I was just curious about the 15 to 20 years. I mean, obviously not rent control. Like, we're thinking like maybe deed restricted affordable housing, like not necessarily inclusionary zoning per se, but something like that. Is that 15 to 20 year gap? That's just like the financing kind of, it gets refinanced after about 15 to 20 years, or
often sooner than that. I think it's just once you're getting out to around that amount of time, there's just like kind of the discount rate, like the present value of these things. There's also just, when a developer is putting a project together, the pro forma usually goes to 10 years and that's kind of it. It's not like they don't care what happens in the future, but it's, the further out in the future you go, the less these revenues really count for anything because of uncertainty and inflation and everything else. Yeah.
Okay. So that's like them when they go for those initial financing, that loan to build.
Yeah.
That's like, okay, cool. Thank you.
I mean, just for an example here, so like St. Paul approved an ordinance or a ballot initiative several years ago. It was a very strict form of rent control that had vacancy control. So it maintained the limits between tenancies, which is a problem. But it also applied to buildings like the day they open. And the issue there, among other things, is even if it's just a rent stabilization policy where rents can reset to market rate when a new tenant replaces the old tenant, the problem can be, if you were to propose a project in 2018 and open it in March or May of 2020, and suddenly rents are down 20 or 30%, very temporarily, but you can't rent out those units because if you rent them at that lower level, you're locked in. And so you're basically bankrupt on day one, or you just have to wait for rents to recover before renting it out at all. It's just really kind of bad incentives that can come from that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay. So in just talking further about rent stabilization, as somebody who is personally, like, I've benefited from rent stabilization because I used to live in California. I think the bigger issue is not in suppressing supply, but I think it like disincentivizes improvements from landlords, and it keeps people trapped in subpar conditions. And not that I want to force people out of their homes, but I don't know. It's just like, it's a Band-Aid that it helps keep people from being homeless, but it doesn't actually help people.
I 100% agree. I do think it helps, but I agree it's not a complete solution. And I think we'll get to the supply stability subsidy and how this fits into stability. But I think virtually all stability policies, they are about keeping circumstances from getting worse for people or worse as quickly. They're not about really making things better. And so for that reason, they tend to be good as like temporary measures, as things to kind of hold people over. But you need other policies, namely supply policies and subsidy policies, to really improve conditions. But I think the way I think about the fact that rent stabilization, not even like hard rent control, the like old style that has very negative consequences, but the more modern kind you see in a place like California, yes, it does kind of lock people in to their home, because if you rented in your home for 10 years, your rent might be 30% lower than the market rate for a similar unit. And so, even if you just want to move into a similar unit, you're going to pay more, much less if you want to kind of upgrade. I think of it as, yes, that is the effect, but like, what is the actual alternative? The alternative in a market where housing supply is suppressed without rent stabilization is the landlord will not improve, or they will improve in rent stabilization. They will not improve the unit, but they also can't improve or increase the rent all that much. Without rent stabilization, if housing is scarce, they will improve the unit, but they're also going to raise the rent enough that in many cases, the person who is living there has to leave. And I think in most cases, the person who's there would rather stay and pay a lower rent and have a lower quality unit than have the unit improved, but it's for someone else, right? So that's how I think about it. And it's, as all of this is, it's all trade-offs, and it's balancing those things and figuring out what is the right tool for the job. And I think rent stabilization is just not the tool for improving housing stock over time. So the framework that I use, good transition, I think, to talk about this in my book, and how I've enlarged this problem of competing narratives. So yeah, and the third subsidy is about providing adequate public funding to help those who lack the resources to afford housing on their own, whether that's just temporarily or permanently longer term. The reason you need all of these three priorities together, in my view, is because different people need different things, and people's needs change over time as well. The protection and stability you might need today should not stand in the way of new opportunities that you would want to be able to take advantage of tomorrow, and it shouldn't have to. It only does that when we try to solve all or most of our housing challenges by focusing on one or two of these priorities to the exclusion of the others. But together, each of these policy priorities or goals can be mutually reinforcing, with the strengths of one tending to make up for the shortcomings of the others. So starting with supply, fundamentally, I don't think a whole lot of selling needs to be made to this group on housing supply. But for me, this is about acknowledging that we live in a world with physical and economic constraints that we can't just wish away. So we have the physical constraint that a growing, aging, changing population requires a growing and changing stock of homes. And I put growing or changing in italics there because, as I was talking to David, or he was mentioning to me earlier, just based on demographic change, shrinking household sizes, many places that are not growing in population at all will still need more housing just to keep up with that change, to say nothing of population growth. So, the U.S. does have a very serious inequality problem, and I want to acknowledge that, and it extends to housing as well, but you can't redistribute your way out of a shortage. These are two separate problems. With housing, we have a distribution problem, an inequality problem, you could say, and we have a scarcity problem, and we need to actually solve both. Taxes and subsidies are usually the best way, or one of the best ways, for addressing these distributional issues. But to reduce scarcity, you just have to build stuff. Then there's the related economic reality that when housing is scarce, homeowners and landlords gain a whole bunch of leverage, and that leverage comes at the expense of home buyers and renters. So I don't think I need to dwell on the fact that housing scarcity is a problem. This is how per capita housing production over the past 60 years or so, it is a downward trend. We are building less housing all the time. I always refer to an analogy in the used car market where, because I think people, they have weird ideas about housing that supply and demand doesn't apply, and yet in every other domain, including used cars, I think people get it. So in just the 2 years following the outbreak of COVID-19, the price of used cars went up by 50%, from an average of about $20,000 in January of 2020 to over $30,000 by 2022. As with housing, this did not happen because the used cars were suddenly all improved, that they got better in some way. They didn't get more expensive because they became nicer. They got more expensive because they became scarcer. New car production declined. Those cars saw their prices rise, and the impacts of that very quickly cascaded down to the used car market. I think maybe a problem we have is just that we don't call used housing. This is something I learned from Tokyo. They have, like, it's a category. It's just housing to us, but it is different. And if we thought about housing that's kind of changing hands and has already been built as used housing, we might understand this a little bit better. But the price of used cars is linked to the price and the availability of new cars. We saw that very clearly. And the price of used housing is linked to the price and availability of new housing. I think the two big differences between the car market and the housing market that are salient are, first, we chose to limit the supply of housing in a way that was kind of just fell upon us in the case of cars. And for cars, we only did, we underbuilt for maybe 2-3 years. For housing, we've been doing it for at least 40. And so we've had a lot of time for the consequences of that to begin to catch up to us. I think in a place like that, supply or rent stabilization should not have much of an impact either way. Then you hear me out. Okay. So the question was, in a weaker market where there's more vacancies, does rent stabilization make sense? Do the benefits outweigh the costs or harms? And I think in some ways, it's almost an easier sell. On the one hand, there's just less need for it. On the other hand, there's just already not as much pressure to raise rents. And so what rent stabilization is probably doing for the most part is limiting these like really egregious edge cases, but not really affecting the market otherwise. This is a point I've made for a long time, that if we were building a lot of housing, then there would be no concern about rent stabilization. If you really believe this idea that building a lot of housing will moderate and stabilize rents and housing prices, then rent control, it's its own form of rent control. And so the regulation is not really the binding constraint anymore. It's the supply of housing. And so that's generally how I think about it. I think there's less need for it, but there's also less harm potentially. And as always, this really does come down to the design, though. You can, even in a market like Pittsburgh, if you were to apply it to new housing from day one, if you were to have vacancy control, if you were to limit rent increases to less than the inflation rate, all of those things would push you toward having, real negative impacts on supply, for sure. Yeah, maybe we don't need to dwell on it too much.
And also in that case, it's just a case for better eviction
protections,
which don't exist in PA.
Right. And so, yeah, you were saying that instead of a rent stabilization, you could have an anti-gouging. From my perspective, anti-gouging is just like on the spectrum from like strict, hard first generation rent control, what people think of when they think of like New York rent control, and then anti-gouging on the other end. And anti-gouging is the one that's like, maybe you can only increase rents every year, inflation plus 5%. That's the policy in California, or 10%, whichever is lower. That's much more than landlords are going to be able to increase rents most years. But again, it kind of addresses those edge cases. So I do agree. Yeah. So, thinking more about the communication side of this, because I think I don't really need to sell folks here on the argument for supply. I think a lot of people, and places want to reject this reality, the importance of supply. They want to stop growth, and cities all along the coast have tried this, and we've seen the results. My observation is that you really can't stop growth, not in a free society where people are allowed to live where they want. You can really only manage the form that growth takes. So by and large, I think cities have one of 3 paths available to them. If people want to live in and move to your city or town, you can grow your housing stock to accommodate them, and that will keep prices from rising as quickly. You can not build housing, and that rising demand will manifest as rising prices instead. Or you're just a place where not many people want to live, and you're probably already stagnating or in decline. And I think given the choice between these options, number one is the pretty obvious pick, and the one that has the most potential to leave our kids and our grandkids and our neighbors' kids and grandkids better off than we were. I think another way of putting this is this image on the right. So I think you can have a city that is appealing, affordable, or unchanging, or maybe and unchanging, but you can only pick 2. If it's appealing and unchanging, it is not going to be affordable. We can think of big, expensive cities like San Francisco and New York. If it's at least, appealing to some people. If it's unchanging and affordable, that's probably because it's not very appealing. You can think of many Rust Belt cities that have not had the same trajectory, frankly, as Pittsburgh has. And if it's appealing and affordable, it's not going to stay that way for long if it's unchanging, if you don't build more homes and plan for a future with more neighbors. So moving on to stability, this will be quick. But once again, this is about protecting vulnerable households and marginalized communities, protecting deed restricted or otherwise low cost housing as well. But I think the stronger case for stability is more of a moral or a philosophical one. If supply is about acknowledging economic and physical constraints in the housing market, then stability really is about acknowledging moral obligations. I love it. Thank you for bringing your child. Genuinely, I love when kids come to these things. Yeah, that's what it's all about. So I think the question to ask here is, how we ensure some minimum level of dignity and security for every household, whether they rent or own. I think, unfortunately, the answer to this question in most US jurisdictions is that if you want security, buy a home. And that was never really a good policy or a fair policy. It very strongly disadvantaged poor people, people of color, for centuries. But I think part of why groups like this and just folks in general are more interested in housing policy is in part because this escape valve of the rental market sucks and we have no protections and it's just terrible. You could always just buy a house until 20, 30, 40 years ago. And now that's just not an option for a whole lot of people who, frankly, also have a lot more political power than the people who haven't been able to buy a house for much longer than that. It's just not a very viable path. And so I think we need to think about how we can and should do better in the future. And then finally, subsidy, again, is about filling gaps, really, where supply and stability policies are not doing everything they should or not solving all of our problems. This is really about investing in affordable, social, public housing, whatever nomenclature you prefer, whatever structure you like. It's investing in rent assistance and shelters and services. It's helping people in need of help, whether briefly during a difficult time or for much longer or permanently when appropriate. I think importantly, it's also about designing taxes and fees to do double duty, not just to raise revenue, but actually to incentivize the right behavior. So this is where property taxes really are important. And something like a land value tax is especially good at this, where it's not just collecting revenue, it's actually pushing people with underutilized property to do more with it. And a real big challenge we have in California is that because of an initiative from 1978, I think it was, or 86, Proposition 13, it limits our property taxes to 1% of property value, but also to basically the level when you bought your home. And so if you bought it a long time ago at a very low price, you're paying almost no property taxes. And people own, parking lots, strip malls that have a ton of capacity for a 6 or a 20-story building, but they don't need the money now. It just keeps getting more valuable. They can wait. If they were paying property taxes on the actual value of those properties, they would sell them or they would redevelop them. And so this is where it's the incentives and the revenue structure. We can kind of double dip here. I really think of this as a three-legged stool. I'm not going to dwell on this. I want to move on, but just to make the point that these are really mutually reinforcing. And when you remove any of these, you are leaving a lot of people behind. You're leaving a lot of interests and needs unaddressed. So getting into what is new here, at the time I wrote this, there were sort of inklings of, yeah, go ahead. Question? Do we have, okay.
In your book, you talked a lot in the subsidy section about like kind of federal reform.
Mm-hmm.
Were there a lot of examples in your mind of subsidy that we can maybe enact locally that are feasible, that don't take like state or federal reform?
Something I wrote about in 2020, which has kind of grown beyond my control in some ways, is transfer taxes. I think there's sort of a hierarchy for me of real estate-based taxes. There's land value taxes are best because they can both raise a bunch of revenue, everyone pays them at some level, and they have like the incentivized behavior that also improves affordability and other good outcomes. Property taxes are kind of just below that. And then transfer taxes, which are taxes just paid on the value of a property at sale and only when it's sold, are, in my view, kind of a third best option. The problem with them, I think, among other things, is only people who sell their property ultimately pay them. And so it's a smaller base, but it can raise quite a bit of revenue. You can structure these things progressively where higher value properties pay more. I think, a really critical thing for me is exempting buildings on their first sale so that you're not discouraging someone who wants to build something and then, ultimately sell it if that's their business model shortly after completing it. And unfortunately, after writing that piece in 2020, some local advocates ran with it, developed an initiative that passed in 2022, I think, and they did not include that exemption. And they had like a $5 million base. Anything under that pays no additional transfer taxes, which is just like, I think someone who has like a $2 million home has something to contribute, but they seem to disagree. But I think that's one option there. I think if you're at that level, yeah, because it's not a marginal tax either. It's just a flat, yeah. I mean, it's distorting. That's not the worst of the problems, yeah. Yes, yeah, Measure ULA, yeah. I'm doing some research actually right now with a colleague at Rand Corporation to see how much the land market has declined in Los Angeles, land on which there's like real potential to build more housing. And we're seeing a pretty big decrease relative to neighboring cities in the same county, like 20, 30, 40%, which is important because there is a provision in that initiative that allows the city council to amend it if it furthers the goals of producing affordable housing. And it's very possible that with an effect that big, because most new housing that's built is mixed income, it's like density bonus, but they have to provide affordable units. It's very possible that the revenues raised just from the sales of newer buildings is much less than it would cost to subsidize the units we're losing, the affordable units alone that we're losing that would have been built without subsidies. So we're trying to make that case. But I think if you have some control over it, it can be a really significant source of revenue. In Los Angeles, again, I think if they had structured it a little better, it'd be more effective at doing this already. But the estimates were around $1 billion a year in a city with a budget of $12 billion. So a very significant addition. So that's one option. And I think thinking about how you can use property tax rebates effectively, that's obviously not a revenue source, but as a means of promoting the kinds of development you want to see. And I think in many cases, not all, it is possible that by allowing that project to go forward that might not have happened otherwise, and giving them 5-10 years of property tax rebates up to some amount, depending on what they've received, in the long run, from the new residents who are going to be paying taxes, from the property taxes it will ultimately pay indefinitely, all those kinds of things. I think in some cases, you can actually have a net benefit to the budget. But the options are really limited. I mean, Pennsylvania is really interesting because it's one of the only places I think that allows a land value tax and allows you to kind of change how improvement in land value is taxed. And I hope y'all try some interesting things there. But I know how hard property taxes are. It's like property taxes and gas taxes activate some like lizard brain part of people that they just cannot act rationally about them. But you got to keep trying, I guess. I think your strategy of like focusing on assessments where it's a little wonky and people are not going to pay as close attention might be a smart one. So just to cover some of this research, when I was finishing the book, there were the first like working papers of some research on the effects of market rate housing on neighborhood rents. So we've known for decades that building more housing, even market rate, relatively expensive housing, helps moderate prices at like the metro area level. There was not really a lot of research showing the concern was, okay, even if I agree with that, which plenty of folks do not, despite the evidence, but even if I agree with that, that doesn't tell me anything about what happens in the neighborhood where that housing is built. So maybe it's good for the region, but bad for my neighborhood. Maybe rents go down overall, but they go up where I live next to that project. And so there were a few working papers, or really just one on this subject, showing that that was not the case. And as the years have progressed, we've had these, go through the journal referee review process, and the evidence is just mounting on both the fact that market rate housing lowers rents even at the very local level, within like 500 feet of a building, even, but also explaining the mechanisms for how this happens. So I think the way a lot of people have talked about affordable, or talked about the impact of supply, is like the filtering process. It's this idea that we're going to build housing now, and it's expensive because new things are expensive. It costs a lot to build housing, but over time that housing is going to age. And if we keep building housing year after year, the housing built today in 40 years is going to be 40-year-old housing. And there's going to be a lot more housing that's much newer and nicer. And so it's going to be cheaper, relatively speaking. That's all true, but that's like not that convincing to people who are interested in affordability right now. Obviously, we need to start, but like, what are you doing for me today? And Evan Mast in the US, doing research in the US, and Christina Bratsu and some folks in Helsinki have done some really good research showing this moving chain, migration chain mechanism for how market rate housing actually improves affordability almost immediately by, sometimes housing production is referred to pejoratively as like trickle down, but what they're actually showing is this housing is more of like a pulling up into higher quality housing. It's creating vacancies at the top of this market in this new housing. People who already live in the metro area leave their existing housing and move into that nicer housing, vacating the older, slightly lower quality, slightly cheaper housing. Some people from even lower quality, cheaper housing move into that recently vacated housing, and down you go. And within a few years, for every 100 new market rate units, something like 40 or 50 units open up in a lower or below median income neighborhood. And so you really see the mechanism for how this market rate housing is helping immediately. And it's not to say it's all we need to build, but it is to say that it's really showing how complementary market rate housing is to affordable housing by creating slack in the lower tiers of the market for people who are not going to be able to afford a market rate home directly, at least not where they're at right now. I've also been really interested in this idea of broad upzoning or mass upzoning, which is this idea of if we can upzone widely enough, as we did in California with our ADU policy, where you can just build an accessory dwelling unit anywhere in the state, basically, on almost any residential parcel. Actually, you can build an ADU and a junior ADU. If you upzone a parcel or a neighborhood, it's very likely that the value of those parcels is going to go way up. And that value is going to be captured essentially by the landowner rather than in the form of cheaper housing. If everywhere allows a lot more housing or significantly more housing, then no one really has the leverage as a landowner to demand a whole lot more from any developer because they have infinite choices. And we actually just got a grant from HUD to study this in the ADU context and see, how much maybe it can apply more broadly. But we're really seeing, so that was the theory, is that you could upzone without land values going up. And so instead of landowners capturing that value, it's captured in the form of cheaper rents, lower housing prices. And as it's been tried out, really, I would say the first place this was tried out was overseas in Auckland. They upzoned about 75% of the city. Production really boomed, and that's shown here with the red arrow or red line being the upzoned areas production. Rents and housing prices stabilized in Auckland relative to neighboring cities. And they actually saw land prices climb on underdeveloped properties, which is good because it's motivating their sale. And they actually fell on heavily developed parcels like condos and that kind of thing, which is also good because it's making housing more affordable. This is from One Final Effort website, but just showing Auckland's rents relative to New Zealand as a whole and Wellington City. The policy went into effect in 2016, I think. So this is like starting at that point, Auckland's basically its rents are flat, adjusted for inflation, whereas other parts of the country went up. Spokane, more recently, just last year actually, upzoned 2/3 of its city. It increased housing, by my estimate, by at least 600%. It basically allows like a 3-story, 60% lot coverage, no parking in most cases, minimal setbacks, no density limits, no FAR limits, just it's just the lot coverage, setbacks, and height are kind of containing how much you can build. But that's like, you can basically build on a 5,000 square foot parcel 8, 10, 12 units just almost citywide. And that's kind of on hold because of some weird mortgage stuff. But that's something I'm really looking forward to seeing what the effects there are. Just in the short term, home prices there have fallen a little faster than other Washington state cities. So that's something. But even more recently, Burlington, Vermont has approved something quite similar to Spokane. I think they passed that unanimously at the city council, as did Spokane. And Sacramento, I think, also unanimously passed something along these lines. Maybe not quite as aggressive, but really promising too. We've done some research at UCLA quantifying the benefits of by right approval processes, so streamlining approvals where there's less discretion, less subjective decision making, and veto points essentially. And what we really saw was that, not surprisingly, when Los Angeles created a pathway to allow by right approvals, those projects were approved more quickly and with less variation. So it was both reducing the time and cost, but also the risk, the uncertainty of building or getting an approval. And this was actually within a project that increased the affordability requirement relative to what the state policy, the state density bonus does. So this was like a more aggressive density bonus program. So not only did we kind of remove some discretion, speed up projects, reduce risk, we also actually got more affordable housing out of these projects as well. So I think it was very important for demonstrating that those things are not in tension. A lot of times people tend to talk about discretion as this thing that is necessary for negotiation to get as much out of the developer as possible. But I think in practice, when you're cutting costs and things in this way, you can just ask more as a standard practice and not have to negotiate every project individually. Even more recently, so in 2022, LA's mayor issued this executive directive 1, that required a 60-day approval decision on all 100% affordable housing. And because of some kind of wonky inner workings of this and interactions with state policy, there have been thousands and thousands of units in hundreds of buildings that have been proposed that are going to be deed restricted affordable housing, deed restricted for 55 years at like fixed rents based on income levels, with no subsidies whatsoever. And so, even I said for a long time, like, supply is important because it keeps prices in check across the market. And that also means our subsidies can go further. We can get more affordable housing out of it. We can get more out of our rent assistance. But I would say, the market is not going to produce like affordable housing on its own. It's just, it costs too much to build. And I was wrong. Like, it turns out actually that when you allow, there's no density limits for these projects. It's very quick, all but certain approval. They get other kind of relief from development standards. Also, the affordability levels are not like deeply affordable. These are maybe, if a 1-bedroom is normally $2,500 or so, these are like $2,000 a month. So it's not, deeply affordable, but it's deed restricted, it's below market, and it doesn't cost us anything. So this has been a really interesting place to watch. And I think a lot of people around the country and even the world are following what's happening there. I've become more pro rent stabilization as I've talked with folks about this, and it's always the thing I get the most questions about even now, as we saw here today. But I think it's really, I think that it is quite easy to design the policy in a way that minimizes the harms and really benefits a lot of people. At the same time, I've become significantly more anti-inclusionary zoning. I was pretty ambivalent about it in the book, and I do think you can still do it in a way that it can work, essentially. Los Angeles's transit-oriented communities program, the one that created that by right pathway, actually did is a density bonus program that, to take advantage, you have to include affordable units, and it's been successful. But that said, I think we're getting a better picture of what the costs are of a policy like this, and how production can really be undermined, and how at some level we are having renters who are much poorer than homeowners pay the costs in the form of lower production and higher rent growth to subsidize a very small number of units for even poorer people. And we should subsidize units for those very poor people, but it should not come on the backs of renters alone. And that's kind of what we've been doing. And I just published a report about that just a month or so ago. We can talk about this, I'll just skip over it, but I'm much more pro-state intervention. I heard there's some interesting things happening in Pennsylvania, which is encouraging. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that cities do still have an important role. And in California, almost every big state reform we've seen was really sold on the impact it had when it was tried at a local level. So getting rid of parking minimums, ADU reform, improving our density bonus, all of these things started in a city. Most other cities were never going to do it, but as long as one city did it, it helped make the case for state reform and bringing everyone along. This is just podcasts we have on these specific topics. Okay, last slide here. I just want to say a little bit about the communication stuff here. When dealing with people who are skeptical, opposed to change, I think 3 points I would just drive home. One is to make the stakes clear that doing nothing, not doing the thing that is being proposed, does not prevent change. It just keeps us on whatever trajectory we are on. And it means that change is just going to happen to us rather than us kind of taking control and trying to shape it to whatever vision we have. I think it's important to speak to your audience, learn what motivates people, and speak to their interests. The great thing about this work, this housing reform work, is the things we're working on, they can support affordability, access to opportunity, economic development, racial justice, environmental goals. You can sell them on just like freedom and liberty, whatever you like. It's all true, and it's not dishonest to speak to your audience in the language and the terms that are going to be meaningful to them, as long as what you're telling them is true. And I think we should all, be careful to do that as much as possible. And I think framing this as positively as possible is really important as well. Unaffordability, high prices, they are a byproduct of high demand, of people wanting to live and stay and have kids and invest in your community. And a lot of places, again, being located where you are, surrounded by the cities in this region that you understand how different things could be and how much more challenging things are, how much those cities would love to have the problems of Pittsburgh, love to have, in some ways, the problems of Los Angeles, of people wanting to come to your city, of being able to harness that demand and passion and do something with it, as opposed to being somewhere where people just want to leave and all you can really spend your time doing is just trying to get them to stay. I think we're, in cities like this, we're in a fortunate place. We're lucky to have this problem. And so really, leaning on that and making that point, I think is really critical in all of this work, not just having it be, you got to eat your vegetables and build housing, because there's real positive things that can come from this. So I'll stop there. I know I went very long, but I would love to chat with folks for as long as this goes and after.
Yeah, I just had a question about the Yucca building, and maybe a possible policy around keeping people in their homes when something like that happens. Has there been any thought to saying, you people who are living in the current building, you get first opportunity to rent this place at the price you're paying right now?
Yes.
Indefinite period of time or whatever you want to say at that point.
There absolutely has. That was actually, I really need to figure out what the status of that building is. It's a really interesting case, and I like talking about it. The downside is I'm not sure it's been built it's been like through so many like iterations as they tried to figure this out, but I think it's also just like market stuff. But that was at least one iteration where they revised it in some different ways. They actually reduced the amount of deed restricted affordable housing, but I think the plan was to make it 100% or mostly rent stabilized and allow the tenants in the existing building to move into the new units, similar size and everything at their previous rent. And so as long as they stayed there, they would have that rent stabilized price. And yeah, I think that was kind of one of my takeaways was if we can be a little more nimble with these policies and not necessarily have them just be like one size fits all, but really try to address the specific circumstances. Obviously, there's like a balancing act there because you can't have these negotiations for every single project, but having kind of rules of the game in place for how you respond to these kind of things is, I think, a really like promising road. And I think it's a really good idea. Like back there.
A few slides back, I forget the exact details, but you were talking about various reliefs that constructions could have.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess just more broadly than that, what is the most effective policies that a city can have to speed up, permitting, right? To get shovels in the ground.
I mean, for permitting specifically, I think you do need some kind of like shot clock that's basically says if the city does not approve this by X date or within a certain number of days, it is deemed approved. And that really puts pressure on cities to get these things done. There's really no particular reason a city can't approve a plan or review whatever within, say, 60 days with some, very limited exceptions. It's really just like, are they willing to put the resources in and do they have the motivation to? And I think a lot of times you need that motivation can come from within the city. And there are places that have done this. A lot of times it has to come from up above, from the state saying like, everyone needs to meet this standard because there's just so many excuses. But was your question just about the permitting or was it about like getting housing kind of in general? Because that sounded like where you're going. I just want to make sure. Okay. I mean, this is a tough one because it's obviously just going to depend on the circumstances. But broadly speaking, like parking requirements, minimum parking requirements are a really big one. My like evolving understanding of parking minimums is not even so much that like the specific amount is the problem. It's that there's a lack of flexibility because most projects still want to provide parking. The challenge is if you have, let's say, a parcel that will fit 50 parking spaces on one floor and you want one floor of parking. And if you go to 2 floors, it's not like adding 10 more spaces only increases, which is 20% of the second floor. It's not increasing your costs by another 20% for that parking garage. It's more than doubling them. And so having that flexibility to say, like, this 60 unit requirement, I actually do want to build parking, but I'm only going to build 50 so I can stay on that one deck and very sharply reduce my costs without really significantly reducing like what I'm offering to my tenants. That kind of thing can be really important. Of course, some folks do want to build without parking, and that's great too. Beyond that, I mean, it's just a combination of, it's really the interaction of height, floor area, which is like the multiple of the lot size. If you have a 10,000 square foot parcel and a floor area ratio of 2, you can build 20,000 square feet total. Setbacks and density. And density is like how many units per like size of lot area. So it's really those 3 things combined. My thinking on that relates to the broad upzoning stuff is we should really be working toward enabling like the 3 and 4 story wood frame, very simple, often no elevator, limited parking apartment and condo buildings, because those are really the sweet spot. This is like missing middle. It's the sweet spot of you're dividing up the land costs between a lot of units. Your construction costs are about the lowest they get. You get to over 5 stories, you're inserting concrete. If you get to over 7 or 8 stories, you're all concrete or steel, which is much more expensive per square foot. It really is that sweet spot. And so it's why places like Spokane are so interesting to me, because I think they're reducing land costs, they're reducing construction costs, they're reducing parking costs, they're kind of doing it all at once. And I think that's kind of where we need to be headed.
We have, on the Zoom, we have somebody. Hopefully, Anthony, you want to ask your question? Hopefully people will hear you.
Oh, yeah, wait, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So like, given the fact that housing, it doesn't only have like a utility value, it also has like a financial asset value. You know, like people take out like loans against it, businesses like use it as collaterals and such. Doesn't that sort of like create a permanent interest against building new housing? Just because that, you know, obviously every house that goes up, it makes the existing quote unquote financial asset less valuable. And like you even alluded to that in the Washington Spokane example, where you know, like the housing prices go down, which is good for renters, but you know, for some person who wants to take out a HELOC loan, that's probably not as good of a use. And my point being, like, doesn't that like that would sort of create like a permanent interest against building housing? Like, do you feel like that's just kind of like the constraint we're working against, or like, yeah, I guess maybe can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. No, this is like the heart of everything at some level. It's a really good question and something I grapple with a lot. I'm working on this idea of like a shared equity rental or rental pension kind of program that I wrote about once in the Atlantic, but I got funded from Chan Zuckerberg Initiative to study further, and hopefully sometime this year we'll have something. But it's sort of trying to address this problem of people have a lot of interest in the value of their home going up, and especially not going down. and also homeowners, unfortunately, like I own my home, so I'm not against it, and I really think everything in American society and our tax structure and so on like really pushes people toward that. But among many challenges with homeownership is homeowners tend to be more NIMBY. They tend to be just more kind of conservative in the way they vote, less pro-tenant, all these kinds of things. And so there is a real tension there. And when I'm traveling around, one thing I almost always say to places that are more affordable than Los Angeles, which is almost everywhere, is, you know, it is almost impossible, short of economic collapse, to make a city more affordable, really. Maybe over the very long term, if you can keep, you know, home prices from going up as fast as inflation, you're going to slowly chip away and improve affordability, perhaps. But the reality is that if we did something that was so effective at improving affordability that home prices fell by 20% in a year, there would be such a huge backlash that progress would probably very quickly be undone. And so I think we need to think about this in very kind of long-term terms. But at the same time, I am careful to also point out that I think a lot of the arguments people have or the beliefs they have about home value appreciation are a little misguided, or at least not complete. I think we look at the home value going up, and I do this myself. Like I look at how much my home has gone up in value since I bought it in 2017. I'm like, oh my God, so much money. But then I look around my neighborhood and all the other homes in my neighborhood went up the same amount. And so it's not like I can take that value and buy a nicer home. If anything, those homes are further away. This is not true in Los Angeles or California, but it's true in most places. It's also the case that as your home value goes up, you're paying more in property taxes. It is certainly true that every dollar I earn in home equity is coming out of someone's pocket down the road. Like, it's not just like economic value that's created, it's economic value that is transferred from someone probably poorer and younger than me in the future to older and richer me. And that's like just not a good way to structure society. What was the other? I mean, and then the other that I think is maybe the most effective argument for building more housing for a lot of people who are not like spending all their time thinking about this stuff is just thinking about, where are your kids going to live? and like what are we trading away for that home value? And I think we're trading away a lot. The way I like put a real fine point on this is it's not just like your kids are not going to be able to live where they grew up and maybe you know, whatever comes from that. It's people are sort of making a choice when they prioritize home value appreciation that they would rather spend the next, 40 years of their life or whatever, have their kids live in another state, see their grandkids once a year, and leave them a $2 million home than have their kids live next to them potentially if they want to, see their grandkids every weekend, every month, whatever, and leave them a $500,000 or $800,000 home. Like, I think when you put it in those terms, most people would prefer to like have their family and the people they care about close to them, and you're still leaving them an asset. It's not like, you're passing along nothing. And ideally, because housing has been kept affordable, they don't need you to pass on a home to them. Like a lot of people my age and many the people in here's age, like that's like our only path to home ownership in many cases. It feels like that's the new American dream, is like not, grow up, get married, have kids, buy a home. It's like do all those things except buy a home and then wait for your parents to die and move into their home. That's a real bummer. But that's kind of where we're at, and we're still going down that road. So those are my many thoughts on home ownership, and I don't know how many are convincing, but maybe one or two.
Well, sorry, I didn't mean to. I just had like a follow up, like maybe comment / question.
Sure.
Like,
All right, a brief follow up, and then next person.
okay. I guess my like isn't like I don't have the stats on it, but I'm assuming a lot of like property value is also tied up in like commercial like buildings, but just commercial buildings of all sorts. Like, how do you that's like a very human sort of like impact, like human sort of approach that you're sort of telling individual homeowners, which might work for a lot of people, but for some CEO making corporate decisions about the second office building in Chicago, like they probably don't care about that. I'm just curious, like like how does that sort of like the tension between, I guess, homeowner who cares about equity and home value and renters who want development and cheaper housing in the corporate sense, like do you have thoughts on sort of how to balance that, or how to, I don't know, like how do you sort of negotiate those tensions, I guess?
I'm not sure I fully understand if you mean like commercial as in like the value of like an office building or something like that.
I guess we can talk offline or later, but
Okay.
I guess it meant more like but yeah.
Okay. Email me.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of inclination from local policymakers to kind of take a very incremental approach to zoning changes. But, it sounds like what you would advocate for is that actually broader, bolder zoning changes are the correct way to do it if you want to actually create broad-based affordability and not just have the benefits of upzoning go to the existing landowners. Can you I guess elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think getting the policymakers to understand that broad zoning changes are actually what need to be made, not incrementalism.
Yeah. So I do agree with that. And I think this idea of broad upzoning has really changed my thinking on housing policy and housing affordability. I guess I don't know how much to add to what you've said, other than, I guess, what we've seen all around the country is, the down zonings that took place in the 60s and 70s and 80s, those were mass down zonings. We were happy to down zone everything at once. But now, as we're kind of recognizing the error of our ways, we're very incrementally, neighborhood by neighborhood, corridor by corridor, sometimes even like parcel by parcel upzoning properties. And I think that's part of why we've gotten so stuck in this space of like, we have to capture all this value. We have to like make these very complicated policies that, give and get, give and take. So we're going to give you more density, give you more floor area and height and so forth. but you have to provide affordable housing and these other things. And in the context of a very like narrow upzoning, I think that's actually the right policy, because otherwise you're kind of just leaving that value on the table, because you are creating a lot of value when you upzone a small number of parcels. Like when there's not many places to develop new housing and the city suddenly says like, these ones go nuts, like that is going to increase their value a lot. And because there's only a limited number of them, there's going to be fierce competition for them. People are going to pay top dollar. Developers are going to compete against each other. And so rather than being able to ultimately like pay almost like a flat price for land, they're paying like all their surplus. And so they can't offer like cheaper rents. They can't provide more affordable housing in the market. They just have to provide the most expensive thing possible to justify what they just spent on all that land. And all that money that was spent on land just goes to some lucky homeowner or property owner, which like is good insofar as it motivated them to sell, but it's just, I think in the long run, not the people we really need to be serving in these zoning reforms. Like we want the benefits as much as possible to devolve to renters and home buyers and people who really need some help, not people who are already doing really well. And so I guess that's some of how I've been thinking about this. And who is it? Daniel Harridge at, I don't know if that's how he was at Strong Towns. He just moved to Parking Reform Network actually, but he also just published a book with Chuck Marone. That's how you pronounce it. Okay, I always forget. But he put this really well. He published something kind of just talking about this independently of my own report in 2022, I think. He framed it as like broad upzoning is this idea of, or comparing it to targeted upzoning. Like if you're at a concert and you stand up, you get a really great view. If everyone else stands up, now it's the same as everyone sitting. Like nothing has actually changed, just everyone is now having to like support themselves standing. And I think to some extent, broad upzoning is something similar. I guess where maybe it breaks down is like, it might imply that everyone's home value goes up or property value goes up, and it just that can't be possible. Like people wouldn't all pay twice as much, 3 times as much for land. It's really, the way I think about it is most property sales every year are single family homes, far and away. Like in Los Angeles, it's 20,000, 30,000 property sales a year, maybe more than that. Maybe 50 or 60 or 80, something like that. But you know, the number of parcels that are being sold for redevelopment into, you know, a 100-unit apartment building, it's in the dozens or low 100 something. And so competition for those is going to be very fierce. But if every one of those single family home parcels allowed 10 units, there's not enough developers in the world. There's not enough demand, frankly. They would not want to build a 10-unit building on all 80,000 or 50,000 of those single family home parcels. And so it's not going to be the developers competing over those homes that is going to determine the price. It's going to be ultimately the home buyers. And we already know what the price they're setting is. It's what it is right now. And so suddenly developers are going to be able to buy these properties at the same amount, which means there's no markup on the land, which again means you're going to be able to pass those savings along to the renters and home buyers.
Thank you, Shane. I will tell everyone, if you don't listen to the Housing Voice podcast, it's awesome. It's really good. The Pathways Home series was like, I was reading Evicted as I was listening to that series, and it was just a really good
compliment.
Yeah, it was excellent. But I wanted to ask about the report, the one about how upzoning doesn't, makes neighborhoods more affordable.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned how the report actually, or one of the studies, kind of confirmed that it went down to some of the most some of the cheapest neighborhoods, or most affordable neighborhoods. What did the report talk anything about how that affected like any displacement trends, things like that? Or was that just kind of out of the scope of that research? Because I was thinking like, well, if that's the case, then those neighborhoods that are most at risk for displacement are actually the ones that could benefit quite a lot from building more market rate housing.
I don't think these ones looked at that. I'm only hesitating because I read Evan Mast's work, like mostly when it was still working paper form, and I've read it since it was reviewed and went into a journal, but it changed a little bit, and so I don't remember if maybe they added something on that. There have been other studies, like Kate Pennington has one, which is just a working paper, and I don't know if that will ever end up published, but that was a study of San Francisco where it both showed that new market rate housing reduced rents nearby, and it showed that it reduced displacement. Displacement is really tough though, because like there's no good measure of it. There are different approaches. One is we're going to just kind of broadly look at, in the neighborhood where the development went in versus a similar neighborhood where one didn't go in, do you have more people moving from the neighborhood into a lower socioeconomic status neighborhood? And that's like a signal that maybe it's like a downgrade and they were kind of forced. Of course, that's not always the case. You might move into a lower socioeconomic status neighborhood, but it's like near your work or has into a nicer home in that neighborhood. It's not like all the housing is homogenous. So it's a very it's important work. It's just very hard to be certain about anything. I think broadly speaking, I would say the evidence is just very mixed about the impact on displacement. I think it's fair to say that policies like rent stabilization and just cause eviction protections, maybe especially, are probably very effective at reducing displacement, all else equal. Just cause eviction protections, for folks not aware, this is basically like you have to have a reason for evicting someone. And it can be something where they violated the lease by not paying rent or damaging the property or causing problems with other tenants. Or there's like usually a defined set of like no fault reasons, like the owner is moving in or they're redeveloping a property or converting it to condos or their family members moving in, those kinds of things. So I think what we really need to be thinking about is not necessarily, not that it's not an important question, but it's a hard question to ask whether upzoning and building housing in these neighborhoods is really increasing displacement in aggregate. And maybe it's not even like the right question to ask, because the aggregate is always, just averaging things out, right? And so even if a development is reducing displacement overall in the neighborhood, but it did directly displace some people and they are worse off, like it would be good if we could do something about that and have some kind of mitigation or protection for them. And so this kind of goes back to the need to pair one kind of priority with others to make up for those deficiencies.
Thank you.
I just want to say about the just cause evictions that there is another downside to that, which is that it makes landlords very risk averse into who they will rent to.
Yeah.
And so it's not something that a policy that you can put in place and say, oh, it's not going to harm anyone. It's not going to harm the people who are currently in homes, but it will harm those very marginal tenants who are trying to get homes, and they will no longer be attractive tenants, even if they can afford to pay.
I think that's a very important point that, and this is true with like inclusionary zoning with mixed income housing, where instead of having, buildings be subsidized and have often like mission oriented developers and landlords operate them, where they also have an interest in picking their tenants a little bit and making sure, that they're going to pay rent and all those kinds of things. But the for-profit, I think, are going to default on average toward a little bit more of the, like, I'm going to make some assumptions based on race or family status or these kinds of things about who's a good tenant, who's not. And so I think that's a real important issue. Again, to bring this back to the bigger picture, I think this is a really good argument for why stability policies alone are just like when you enact them in isolation, you are creating those unintended consequences. When you have a policy like that and you have a lot of vacancies where landlords really don't have a lot of choice, suddenly the downsides, I think, don't look so bad. Not to say they don't exist, but I think it minimizes them.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, from working in a city, in rental housing in a city that had both homes that were rent controlled and not rent controlled, you're going to slot certain tenants into, like, you want people who are going to move on quickly, and you put those in the rent controlled tenant into the rent controlled.
Yeah, like students and that kind of
young couples.
You don't want like a family. Yeah, it is a real issue. You just avoid that fight.
When we talk about mass upzoning, some cities have done like eliminating single family only. Some have done where they legalize more and more missing middle. Yeah. What's like the most promising version of upzoning? Is that taking every parcel and allowing like the next level of housing to be built from like duplexes to triplexes and then triplexes to fourplexes? Is there any like examples or like what's the most ideal version of a mass upzoning that you've seen?
I love that question because it's actually somewhere where Chuck Marone and I very strongly disagree. He's much more of the kind of incremental, like allow the next level up. And I will say, like, I think the smaller and lower density and less like pressured, less unaffordable really market you have, the better that incremental approach works. In a place like Los Angeles, upzoning single family parcels to 2 or 3 units, in a lot of cases just isn't gonna result in a redevelopment. And I think just broadly speaking, it is true that the value of the replacement, whatever you're building to replace what exists now, has to be a lot higher than what's there. Otherwise, why go to all the trouble? Not only of like just getting it entitled and permitted and everything and hiring contractors and so forth, but also, you have to demolish it. You're not either using or earning revenue from it for years. There's a lot of costs associated with it. So whatever's replacing it does have to be significantly larger. And I think a place like Los Angeles, I feel very strongly that, a fourplex, allowing fourplexes in every parcel would not be sufficient. I think there's an issue with when the average home is $1 million, if you're going to allow 4 per parcel, it's still $250,000 per unit in land alone. And in some cases that will be worth it, maybe because the building is just really small and low quality and whatever. It was going to be turned into a McMansion anyway. Like, good, it's 4 units. They're going to be much more affordable than that. But I think if we really want like the kind of transformative change and not just like extremely incremental here and there, which is what we need in many cities, it has to be, really multiples of what is allowed or at least what is on the site currently.
Yeah, actually, if I could speak to that, because that's something that's kind of a dynamic here in Pittsburgh. I mean, one element I would say is, I think the part of that gets a little bit missed is that developers are actually quite a bit more clever than we give them credit for. So here in Pittsburgh, for instance, there are examples all over the place where an existing single family house was extended in numerous ways, reconfigured internally. I have a sneaking suspicion that even if you just did a partial upzone of a place like in LA, even if you bought that single family home, you probably could attach on in an affordable
We've
way
seen that
to those.
with the ADU laws.
Right.
The ADUs have been extremely popular. And I did want to add that the kind of exception in a way is ADU policies, accessory dwelling units, and where you don't have to tear down the existing structure. Basically, it's the land is in some sense free, or from the perspective of the owner, it's free because they've already paid for it. So the cost of the building is just the cost of the building for them.
And I feel like that there's a trick here for us in Pittsburgh where a lot of our neighborhoods are secretly very, very heavily multifamily. We just don't think about them that way. So we have, like in my neighborhood of Highland Park, you have basically broad scale single family zoning But if you actually tried to upzone it to the next level, you'd actually still end up with less allowed zoning than the number
Are
of
these like
units are actually-
subdivided older homes?
Right,
that
exactly. These are
might have
enormous
roommates
these are
and
enormous
students, that
single-family
kind of thing?
homes that are divided. I mean, you literally see 6 meters on a single house.
Uh-huh.
Very, very readily.
Oh, so they're like formally.
Oh yeah, like these are
Yeah.
huge. Yeah, like very.
Yeah.
And even and even in other neighborhoods where it's just a lot of more smaller homes, it's still 2 or 3 units potentially within what you would classically think of as single family home.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I'm kind of thinking about in terms of, and I feel like a lot of East Coast cities are in a similar situation. The next level of upzoning probably is a lot higher jump than we think it is.
Yeah.
Because of all this hidden density that's sitting around because of the age and the size of these old homes. So.
We think a lot in terms of units, but I've been trying to think about how I could work this into research. But like, you know, if California builds 100,000 homes and they're all 1-bedrooms, that's very different than if all of them are 3-bedrooms. Like the capacity of those is very different. And so the fact that we treat them all equally, it's just like it's a housing unit, is really missing something.
It's interesting, like you just dog who gets
microphone.
Yeah, you look at a lot of these homes in Pittsburgh that are 4-plexes or 6-plexes. They just look like houses too, and it's like I think this is where a disconnect happens a lot of times. Like people think, oh, I live in this single family neighborhood, and they don't even realize that they live 3 doors down from a triplex that just looks like a regular house.
Yeah. So, and it turns out it's perfectly fine. I mean, they actually like their neighborhood.
It is. There maybe one more question that
just
Wow.
I think you can go anytime you want. Not until Corey is done talking.
That's right. The biggest guy in the room, of course, I have to install that rule. So this is kind of a point and a question. So I grew up in public housing. You know, I grew up in Eloquent up in Beaver County, and public housing was like pretty much like the last thing before homelessness that you could acquire. However, it was actually decent quality housing compared to the overall housing stock around it. So like that's one point. And my question is this: when we go with public housing in the future, what is your view as to what the best method is? Because the way we did it for low income housing was 35% of your income went to rent. Mm-hmm. And, for my mother and I, who were both disabled, that meant $355 for a 3-bedroom apartment. I know that sounds like obscene now, but that was a significant chunk of money for us. That was 35% of our income. Meanwhile, our next door neighbor, who also had a 3-bedroom, there was a income limit, but if you lived there pre-existing and you went above the income limit, they wouldn't kick you out.
Right.
So then they just adjust your rent. So the person who was making double next door for the same apartment was paying $650. So, obviously like that isn't an equitable way of going about it. But I'm curious as to what your view is as to what would be an equitable and sustainable manner of investing and building public housing without having incidents like that.
I mean, I kind of feel like that is pretty equitable, that, they make more, they're paying more, and up to a certain point, you wouldn't want them paying more than market rate if their income went way higher. But I think you bring up, to even like go back further, your point about when you're making $1,000 a month, like this 30 or 35% standard is still really onerous, because even if you paid nothing in rent, like it's hard to get by on $1,000 a month. And so this has come up in, research literature and other places year after year, decade after decade. There's an idea of like one alternative approach is like a residual. It's like how much you have left over after rent is kind of more important, because like if I make $200,000 a year and I'm paying 50% of my income on rent or mortgage or whatever, like still $100,000 left over. I'm doing fine, like it is actually affordable to me. I don't make that, but I think recognizing those distinctions is really important. I mean, more broadly, I think I'm a big supporter of subsidizing housing through a lot of different means, both building it and just helping people pay rent in whatever housing they can find. And also policies like source of income non-discrimination that actually make it easier for them to find housing. But I do think our model of public housing was an abject failure. And I think defending it as it was is like, just, I get it from people like to my left, which is not that many people, but like, I hear that sometimes. I'm like, we don't need to defend it. It was bad. Other places have done it so much better. They're doing it so much better. We can learn from them and not pretend that what we did before was good and it would be fine if we brought it back. Like, we designed a bad program, and frankly, that was like, you know, certain members of Congress and Senate and so forth, they didn't want it to succeed, and so it was designed to not support itself, and we got what we paid for, essentially. And so I think going forward, we really need to figure out more of a mixed income model where, you know, it's not only everything from market rate to deeply discounted, but also is much more like, right now, the way we do affordable housing mostly is like, this is for people who earn 60% of area median income or below, which in practice means like someone who's between 50 and 60. Because if you make 30% of AMI, you can't afford that 60% of AMI rent. It's 2/3 of your income. So that's not viable. I would love to see something where it's just no particular units are like, this is only for this group. It's just whatever your income is, you pay this percent. And, you know, it still might only be offered to people below some threshold, but is a lot more kind of appropriate to their individual circumstances. And we don't have this weird allocation issue where it's like, this unit needs to find this precise person. Like, housing is fungible. Living in this unit versus that unit in the same building, like, who really cares? But because of how we set up the system, it really does matter. And I don't think it should.